The engine noise was a consistent low thrum, a monotonous rhythm that Jake had come to rely on over 17 years of hauling freight across the continent. Tonight, the rhythm felt particularly heavy, the air thick with the dust of the Arizona high desert and the lingering scent of diesel exhaust. He was running ahead of schedule, a minor victory that translated into an extra hour of sleep, or perhaps just an extra hour of staring at the oppressive blackness outside his cab. The clock on the dash read 02:17 a.m. He took the mandatory exit, pulling off the interstate onto a seldom-used maintenance road adjacent to an old, decommissioned way station. This spot offered seclusion. No flashing lights, no other drivers idling, just the vast cold silence of the desert night. He cut the main lights, letting the dim amber markers of the rig define the massive silhouette against the distant faint glow of the city 30 miles east. He killed the engine. The sudden absence of sound was overwhelming. Replaced only by the faint ticking and cooling of the metal components, he reached for his logbook, a necessary ritual before attempting rest. That was when he heard it, a sound that did not belong. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the rustle of desert scrub. It was a sharp, choked noise, brief and immediately suppressed, like a small animal caught unaware, except it carried a distinct, fragile human quality. Jake paused, his hand hovering over the ignition switch. He was accustomed to the paranoia of the road, the tricks the mind plays in isolation, but this felt different, too close and too precise to be imagination. He sat rigid for a full minute, listening intently. Nothing, just the desert reclaiming the silence. He dismissed it, attributing it to fatigue, and began to log his stop time. Then he saw the movement. It was a slight shift in the shadows near a corrugated metal culvert, about 20 feet from his front bumper, just at the edge of his low-beam spill. It was too low to be a coyote, too hesitant to be a rabbit. It was a small, fetal shape, huddled against the cold concrete. He reached for the heavy-duty flashlight stored beneath his seat, its weight familiar and reassuring. He opened the driver's side door, the hydraulic hiss a jarring intrusion into the quiet. The cold air hit him immediately. He stepped down, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel shoulder, and moved slowly toward the anomaly, holding the beam steady. The light fixed upon a child. It was a girl, impossibly small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, though her size suggested younger. She was curled tightly, knees drawn to her chest, trying desperately to blend into the grey concrete. Her clothes, once a light color, were now caked in layers of fine reddish grit and dark, wet mud. Her hair was matted, obscuring most of her face, but the small sliver of skin Jake could see was pale and streaked with dirt and tear tracks. The moment the beam touched her, she flinched violently, pulling her head deeper into the protective cocoon of her thin arms. She made no sound this time, just a rapid, shallow intake of breath. The fear emanating from her was a palpable, sharp energy. Jake lowered the flashlight slightly, angling it toward the ground to soften the intensity. He kept his voice low and steady, projecting calm authority, the kind that came from years of dealing with roadside emergencies. "Hey, it's all right. I'm just a driver. You're safe here." He waited for a response. There was none. Only the slight, continuous tremor that shook her tiny frame. He took a single slow step closer. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me your name?" Still nothing. She was completely non-responsive, locked in a state of terror that transcended simple fright. Her eyes, when he finally caught them reflecting the beam, were wide, dilated voids, fixed not on him, but on some internal horror. This wasn't a lost child who wandered off a campsite. This was a child who was running, or had been abandoned in circumstances too severe to process. The moral weight of the situation settled instantly and heavily on Jake. The protocol was rigid. Immediately contact the local sheriff's department. But the local sheriff's department meant flashing lights, sirens, interviews, and the inevitable, terrifying bureaucracy that would force this already traumatized child to speak before she was ready. Looking at the sheer, paralyzing fear in her eyes, Jake knew that immediate official intervention might shatter her completely. He made a snap decision, prioritizing immediate protection over procedure. He crouched down slowly, minimizing his profile, making himself appear less threatening. "I'm going to help you," he said, the words simple and firm. "We need to get you warm." He moved with deliberate, practiced slowness, offering his hand, palm up. She didn't take it. He waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, almost inaudible drone of highway traffic passing miles away. The air was turning colder. He had to act. Without touching her, he retreated a step, retrieved the heavy wool blanket he kept in the truck for emergencies, and approached again. He knelt and gently placed the folded blanket on the ground a foot away from her. Then he backed up another 2 feet. "The blanket is for you," he explained. "It's warm. When you're ready, you can take it." The child remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, she darted forward, snatched the blanket, and immediately burrowed beneath it, pulling it over her head. The movement, though quick, revealed a small detail Jake hadn't noticed. A thin, brightly colored piece of braided fabric tied tightly around her left wrist, contrasting starkly with the grime on her skin. It looked specific, almost ceremonial, certainly not standard-issue clothing. It was a marker. This was not random. Jake took this as his cue. He couldn't leave her there, exposed and terrified. He spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to pick you up now. We're going to my truck. It's warm inside. I won't hurt you." He waited, giving her a chance to resist, but she remained silent, a mound of wool and fear. He moved toward her, carefully scooping up the small, light bundle. She tensed immediately, a whimper finally escaping her throat, a sound so fragile it pierced the night. He held her close to his chest, one arm supporting her back, the other cradling the blanket. He felt the rapid, frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. He carried her back to the cab. Climbing the steps into the massive truck was awkward with the precious, fragile cargo. He settled her carefully onto the passenger seat, strapping her in loosely with the seatbelt over the blanket, ensuring she wouldn't fall but giving her room to move. He turned the ignition, letting the powerful engine rumble back to life, and cranked the heating system until warm air began to flow strongly through the vents. The child remained curled, hidden, silent. Jake didn't press her. He needed to assess the situation, to understand what she was fleeing. He looked down at the floor mat where she had been sitting. A small, dark stain of wet dirt marked the carpet. He reached down to examine the grime on the blanket. It was a distinct fine red clay, common in this remote region but mixed with something else, a dark, oily residue that smelled faintly metallic, not like gasoline or standard oil, but something harsher, almost industrial. He reached into his glove compartment, pulling out a small sealed bottle of water and a packet of unopened crackers. He placed them carefully on the center console. "Food and water are here when you're ready," he said, his eyes scanning the side mirrors. The moment he looked away from the child, he saw it. Far down the service road, maybe a quarter-mile back where the road met the interstate exit ramp, 2 pinpricks of light appeared. They were headlights, stationary, high off the ground, suggesting a truck or a large SUV sitting silently in the darkness. They hadn't been there 2 minutes ago. They were watching the location where his rig was parked. A cold certainty settled over Jake. Whoever was looking for this child knew exactly where she had been dropped or where she had last been seen. His vehicle, a massive, brightly lit Class 8 truck, was an impossible beacon in the desolate night. He was exposed. He had perhaps 30 seconds before those lights moved, before they realized the child was no longer huddled near the culvert. He grabbed the microphone for his CB radio, hesitating. Calling for help meant giving his exact location and potentially leading the threat right to his door. He had to move now. He slammed the transmission into gear, the air brakes hissing a final protest, and pulled the rig sharply off the maintenance road, not toward the interstate, but deeper into the grid of dusty, unpaved agricultural access roads that crisscrossed the scrubland behind the abandoned way station. The lights behind him remained stationary for another 3 seconds. Then they began to move, slowly, deliberately, turning onto the same access road. Jake floored the accelerator, the heavy engine roaring as he plunged his massive truck into the absolute darkness, the dust swirling behind him, praying the child remained silent, because he knew, with chilling certainty, that the ride had just begun, and the darkness was closing in fast. The massive engine of the Peterbilt roared, a deep, guttural sound swallowed quickly by the thick, dry air of the Texas scrubland. Jake was navigating terrain meant only for tractors and utility vehicles, the heavy rig bucking violently over exposed roots and deep ruts carved by flash flooding months earlier. The access road was barely 2 lanes wide, choked with mesquite trees and thick brush that scraped aggressively against the chrome side mirrors and the aluminum skin of the tanker trailer. The boy Leo remained terrifyingly silent in the passenger seat, gripping the worn leather armrest, his presence a heavy, critical weight that Jake could not afford to ignore. He kept the headlights on high beam, not for visibility, which the dust made impossible, but as a necessary target for the trailing vehicles. He watched his mirrors, the twin beams behind him, now visibly closer, cutting violently through the swirling reddish cloud kicked up by his dual tires. They were gaining ground. This was not typical pursuit. A civilian vehicle would have broken an axle or overheated by now. The persistence suggested competence, perhaps specialized equipment, or a vehicle built for exactly this type of off-road brutality. Jake glanced at the dashboard. He was burning fuel rapidly, the heavy demand on the engine pulling his consumption down drastically. He had maybe 30 minutes of this pace before he risked overheating or running dry in the middle of nowhere. He needed to break the line of sight and establish a defensive position. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, forcing the truck into a series of punishing S-curves that required constant micro-corrections to prevent the trailer from whipping out and rolling them. He knew this land. He had driven these forgotten roads hauling equipment for independent drillers years ago. He remembered a cluster of abandoned storage silos and a derelict feed mill about 5 miles ahead. A concrete fortress that might offer temporary concealment and strategic advantage. He pushed the truck harder, shifting down precisely as he hit a sharp, unexpected dip in the road, the airbag suspension groaning under the sudden compression. The lights behind him momentarily disappeared as the pursuers hit the same dip, allowing Jake a fleeting window. He immediately cut the wheel hard to the right, ignoring the loud tearing sound as a thick branch ripped the radio antenna clean off the roof. He executed a controlled, high-speed power slide, using the momentum of the trailer to swing the cab into a narrow, overgrown track, barely visible through the thicket. This maneuver was reckless but effective. The pursuing vehicles, committed to the main access road, shot past the barely concealed turnoff before realizing their error. Jake killed the engine immediately upon entering the dense cover of the track. The sudden silence, broken only by the rapid clicking of the cooling exhaust manifold and his own labored breathing, was deafening. He reached across the cab, placing a firm, stabilizing hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay quiet. Do not move, not a sound," he instructed, his voice low, rough, but steady. Leo simply nodded, his eyes wide, reflecting the faint green glow of the instrument panel. Jake moved with practiced efficiency. He reached under the driver's seat, retrieving a heavy-duty tactical flashlight with an extremely focused beam and a compact, military-grade radio frequency scanner, equipment necessary for working in remote areas where reliable communication was non-existent, but invaluable now. He clipped the scanner to his belt, setting it to sweep for UHF and encrypted frequencies typically used by organized groups operating outside standard channels. The silence lasted only 90 seconds before the sound of heavy tires crunching gravel returned, much slower now, calculating. They had stopped just past the entrance to his hiding spot, backing up cautiously. Jake peered through the narrow slit of the driver's side window, shielded by the thick canopy of dry leaves. He could see the profile of the lead vehicle. It was an armored SUV, not a standard civilian car, painted a dark, matte color. It explained their speed and resilience on the rough terrain. A figure emerged from the driver's side, tall and lean, clad in dark, nondescript tactical clothing. The figure held a powerful spotlight, systematically sweeping the brush line. They were professionals, moving with slow, deliberate confidence. They weren't panicking, they were hunting. The scanner on Jake's belt suddenly crackled, emitting a short burst of static, followed by a heavily compressed, coded voice, speaking in sharp, clipped Spanish. The phrase was too short to translate fully, but the tone was clear. Search pattern deployed. They knew he was close. They were setting up a perimeter. Jake had only one chance to buy time. The old mill was less than a mile further down the barely visible track, but he needed to disable their scouting capability first. He reached behind the seats again, pulling out 2 items: a powerful directional sonic emitter designed originally to deter wildlife from damaging crops, and a small, reinforced crowbar. He slid out of the cab, moving silently along the shadowed side of the truck, utilizing the truck's massive silhouette as cover. He checked on Leo one last time through the sleeping compartment window. The boy was curled up, completely still. He crept to the rear of the tanker trailer, where the main access road was visible through a thinning of the brush. The two figures from the SUV were now separated, walking slowly towards the area where Jake had made his sharp turn, holding their lights low. Perfect. Jake quickly attached the sonic emitter to a heavy steel coupling near the trailer's axle, positioning it to broadcast directly toward the main road. The device was non-lethal, designed only to cause intense localized auditory distress and disorientation. He set the timer for a 30-second burst 5 minutes from now. The goal was not to injure, but to force them to retreat temporarily, disrupting their organized search pattern and buying the necessary time to reach the mill. He returned to the cab, the crowbar now gripped firmly in his hand. He put the truck in neutral and allowed the heavy rig to coast silently forward on the downhill grade of the hidden track, avoiding the noise of the engine until the last possible moment. He felt the tension coil in his stomach. 5 minutes. He reached the derelict Smithfield Mill complex, a sprawling, forgotten monument of rusted corrugated iron and cracked concrete silos. The perfect place to disappear. The main entrance was blocked by a massive, rusted gate, secured by a chain as thick as his wrist. He needed to breach it instantly. He stopped the truck precisely 3 feet from the gate, shifted the transmission into park, and grabbed the crowbar. Just as he stepped out, the 5-minute timer elapsed. The sonic emitter unleashed its payload. The sound was not a roar, but a high-frequency, piercing shriek designed to vibrate the inner ear violently. Even muffled by the distance and the intervening brush, Jake felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes. He heard shouts immediately from the main road, followed by the clatter of dropped equipment and the rapid slamming of car doors. The organized search had dissolved into hurried chaos. He used the momentary diversion to attack the gate. He wedged the crowbar into the weakest link of the chain, putting all his considerable weight and torque into the steel. The chain protested with a loud, tearing metallic scream that echoed terrifyingly off the concrete silos, but it snapped. Jake shoved the heavy gate inward, jumped back into the cab, and fired the engine. He plunged the truck into the mill complex, the tires grinding over ancient gravel and broken glass. He drove directly into the shadow of the largest central silo, a structure over 70 feet tall that offered absolute concealment from the road. He cut the engine again, the silence returning, heavy and absolute. He checked the scanner. The coded chatter had resumed, frantic and localized. They knew he was inside. Jake knew the layout of the mill. There was an old service ramp, barely used, leading down into a sub-level loading bay that was completely sealed off from the outside world, except for one heavy steel door. If he could get the truck down there, he could secure the door and eliminate the immediate threat of capture. It was a massive risk. If they found the ramp entrance before he secured it, he would be trapped underground. He reversed the truck carefully onto the degraded concrete ramp, the trailer tires slipping slightly on the moss. The entrance to the loading bay was a tight squeeze, requiring him to fold in the side mirrors, but the truck slid through the opening with inches to spare. Once the cab was fully inside the subterranean level, he killed the engine. The air was cool and smelled heavily of dust, mold, and long-dead grain. He grabbed the tactical light. "Leo, stay here. You are safe in the sleeper. If anyone but me opens that door, you hide under the bunk. Understand?" "Yes, sir," the boy whispered back, his voice small but firm. Jake's immediate priority was the heavy steel door separating the loading bay from the upper level of the mill. The door was held shut by a series of heavy deadbolts, but they were rusted and stiff. He worked quickly, lubricating the bolts with oil from a maintenance kit and forcing them into place. Click, clack, thunk. 3 heavy bolts shot home. He now had solid steel between himself and the pursuers. He walked back up the ramp, his movements silent, checking the structural integrity of the mill's interior. The upper level was a maze of rusted machinery and vertical metal stairs. He needed to know where they would enter. The scanner on his belt began to pulse rapidly. A new frequency. Not the coded Spanish, but a clear, unencrypted voice speaking perfect English, calm and professional. Subject is located within the Smithfield complex, confirmed by tire marks and sonic interference origin. We are initiating primary ingress through the main silo access hatch. Secondary team secure the perimeter and check all sub-level vents. Remember the objective. We are retrieving the package. Do not damage the package. The confirmation hit Jake like a physical blow. They weren't just looking for him. They were looking for the boy, and they referred to him as the package. This was not a random act of violence. This was a calculated extraction by an organized entity. Jake retreated silently down the ramp into the protected confines of the loading bay. He had bought time, but the clock was ticking down to 0. The steel door would hold for a while, but not against power tools or explosives. He leaned against the cool side of the truck, the light beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. He was trapped, but he was also hidden. The vehicle was secure. He looked at the boy, who was watching him intently from the sleeper berth. Jake reached into a hidden compartment built into the floor panel of the cab, a spot that held his survival gear, maps, and contingency plans that had been gathering dust for years. He pulled out a satellite phone, heavily protected and rarely used. He couldn't call the police. They would ask too many questions, and the men outside would simply vanish only to return later. He had to prepare his own defense, his own solution. He stared at the phone, then at the steel door, calculating the seconds until they breached it. The darkness had closed in completely, but Jake was no longer running. He was waiting, and he was preparing to act. The next move would define not only his fate, but the boy's, and the fight had just moved from the open road to the close quarters of a concrete tomb. The air inside the cab grew heavy, thick with the smell of diesel and impending conflict. Jake didn't waste time on the satellite phone. The signal was weak, and any call would alert the men to his true location, drawing immediate fire. His primary goal was not communication, but disruption. He slid the phone back into its compartment, locking it with a decisive click, and turned his attention to Ethan. The boy was pressed against the back wall of the sleeper berth, pale but silent, his eyes wide and fixed on Jake. Jake spoke softly, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the sudden violent scraping sound originating from the passenger side of the truck. "Stay down, Ethan. No matter what you hear, you do not move until I tell you." The boy nodded once, a quick, jerky motion. The scraping intensified, followed by the dull, resonant thunk of a heavy tool impacting reinforced steel. They were attempting to breach the door, likely using a hydraulic spreader or a heavy-duty pry bar, aiming for the hinges or the latch mechanism. They knew the cab was armored, but they were determined, relying on brute force and the psychological pressure of the enclosed space. Jake moved with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this scenario countless times in his mind, though he had prayed he never would have to execute it. From the hidden compartment, he pulled out 3 crucial items: a compact military-grade strobe light attached to a magnetic base, a small specialized canister labeled Type C suppressant, which contained a highly irritating but non-toxic chemical haze designed to cause temporary disorientation and respiratory distress, and a pair of heavy-duty industrial-grade zip ties cut and modified for quick application. He secured the strobe light to the center console, ensuring its beam would flash directly toward the passenger door once activated. The suppressant canister he placed near the floor vent on his side. He then donned a simple, dark ballistic vest and secured a light, flexible harness around Ethan, ensuring the boy could be rapidly pulled to safety if necessary. The seconds were evaporating like steam, marked by the rhythmic, grinding assault on the passenger door. A final, sickening crunch signaled success. The heavy steel of the door buckled inward, tearing away from the frame just enough for the men to gain leverage. A gruff voice, muffled by the damaged metal, barked an order in a dialect Jake didn't immediately recognize, but the intent was universal: move in. A massive shadow fell across the fractured opening as the first man attempted to wedge himself inside. This was Jake's moment. He slammed his hand down on the activation button for the strobe light. The cab instantly dissolved into a chaos of blinding, rapid white flashes. Simultaneously, he triggered the Type C suppressant. A violent hiss erupted from the canister, and within 3 seconds, the small confined space of the cab filled with a dense yellowish-green haze, acrid and immediately suffocating. The man attempting to enter recoiled instantly, blinded by the strobe and choking on the chemical haze, his attempt at entry dissolving into a desperate, rasping cough. He stumbled backward, colliding heavily with the man behind him. The sound of their heavy boots scuffing the concrete floor outside confirmed their disorientation. Jake had bought himself precious time, and more importantly, had neutralized their initial advantage of clear sight and coordinated entry. He retrieved a small, powerful headlamp from his kit, activating it only in its infrared mode. He pulled a specialized respirator mask over his face, a simple rubber device that filtered out the irritant, allowing him to breathe normally within the chaos he had created. He looked back at Ethan, who was shielding his eyes but had remained motionless and silent, exactly as instructed. "We move now," Jake whispered, his voice slightly distorted by the mask's filter. He unlatched the driver's side door, which had remained undamaged. Using the distraction of the smoke and the strobe, he slipped out of the cab, pulling Ethan out immediately after him, keeping the boy low to the ground, tucked against the massive tires of the truck. The warehouse was now a visual and acoustic nightmare for the pursuers. The strobe light, flashing relentlessly from inside the cab, cast violent shifting shadows that made depth perception impossible, especially when combined with the thick, choking haze that was now slowly leaking out of the cab and beginning to fill the immediate area around the truck. Jake moved silently, sticking to the shadows beneath the truck's massive chassis. He could hear the men shouting, their voices tight with anger and confusion, their movements clumsy and panicked. They were still focused on the cab, believing their targets were still inside, incapacitated by the haze. This was the precise misdirection Jake had intended. He reached the rear axle, pulling Ethan close. He scanned the area through his IR headlamp. 2 figures were visible near the front passenger side, hacking violently, their flashlights sweeping wildly but uselessly through the haze. A third figure, clearly the leader, distinguished by his more controlled though equally panicked movements, was standing further back, near the point where the massive warehouse door had been sealed shut. This man was using a handheld radio, attempting to coordinate a response, but the static from the enclosed space seemed to be interfering. The crucial detail Jake noted was that the third man was blocking the only clear exit route. Jake had to disable the 2 closest threats first, and he had to do it silently and quickly, before the leader realized the truck was empty. He signaled to Ethan, pointing toward a stack of wooden pallets piled high near the warehouse wall, approximately 20 feet away. The goal was to reach that temporary cover. He pressed a button on a small remote control in his hand, a secondary function of the truck's anti-theft system, which triggered a deafening, high-pitched alarm horn, not from the cab, but from the rear trailer unit. The sudden, piercing shriek was designed to momentarily overload the senses, serving as a final, intense distraction. As the 2 men near the cab instinctively covered their ears and cursed under their breath, Jake acted. He pushed Ethan forward, using the cover of the noise and the lingering haze, sprinting toward the pallet stacks. He moved with a speed that belied his size, covering the distance in 3 long strides. Ethan, terrified but compliant, scrambled behind the pallets. Jake didn't follow him immediately. Instead, he peeled off toward the nearest pursuer, who was still disoriented and rubbing his eyes, attempting to clear the sting of the suppressants. Jake approached from the blind side, utilizing the echo of the alarm and the residual visual chaos. He didn't use a weapon. He used pure leverage and precision. His elbow connected sharply and swiftly with the back of the man's neck, just below the occipital bone. A focused impact designed to cause temporary motor system failure without lasting injury. The man collapsed instantly, a heavy, dead weight hitting the concrete floor without a sound, save for the muffled thud. Jake quickly secured the man's hands behind his back, using one of the pre-modified zip ties, cinching it tight. It was a clean, silent takedown. The second man, hearing the inexplicable sound of his partner collapsing, spun around, raising his arm, which held a heavy, metallic object, likely a pipe or a club, not a firearm, thankfully. He saw a shape emerging from the haze, but the strobe was still interfering with his vision. Jake was already moving. He didn't engage directly. Instead, he dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him with a powerful low kick. The man crashed down hard, the wind knocked out of him. Before he could recover, Jake was on him, securing the second pair of zip ties around his wrists. 2 threats were neutralized in less than 15 seconds, rendered immobile and silent, trapped in the confusion they had created. The alarm horn finally ceased, leaving a ringing silence that was even more oppressive than the noise. The leader, standing by the far door, now realized something was fundamentally wrong. The haze was thinning, and he could see 2 bodies on the floor near the truck, and the cab entrance was wide open. He didn't need to check the truck to know they were gone. He drew a pistol, the metallic scraping sound echoing loudly in the vast space. "Show yourself," he roared, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "This ends now." Jake was already gone from the immediate vicinity of the truck. He was pressed flat against the concrete wall, 20 feet from Ethan's hiding spot, utilizing a natural shadow line created by the high industrial shelving units. His breath was steady in the filtered air of his mask, The leader was armed and clearly panicked, making him the most dangerous opponent. The confrontation had escalated from a tactical game of misdirection to a deadly hunt within the confines of the warehouse. Jake knew he could not allow the man to gain control of the space or, worse, discover Ethan. He had to draw the leader toward him, away from the vulnerable hiding spot. He needed a final, decisive maneuver to end the conflict without bloodshed, ensuring the man was incapacitated long enough for Jake to secure the exit and retrieve the boy, finally breaking free of the concrete tomb. He looked up toward the ceiling. High above, suspended from the steel rafters, were the massive coiled cables for the main industrial hoist, heavy, thick steel lines that ran the length of the warehouse. A risky, high-leverage gambit formed in his mind. He silently pulled out a small, specialized tool, a heavy, magnetically guided climbing claw from his utility belt. The leader was slowly advancing, cautiously sweeping the pistol back and forth, his eyes straining through the fading haze, focusing intently on the pallet stacks, where he instinctively sensed movement. Jake had to move vertically, utilizing the architecture of the building to turn the tables entirely, transforming the hunter into the prey one last time. He took a deep, steady breath, calculating the precise angle needed to ascend without making the slightest sound against the hollow steel beams. The fight was far from over. It had merely moved to a higher plane of engagement. The magnetic claw whined momentarily, a nearly imperceptible high-frequency sound swallowed instantly by the sheer volume of the empty warehouse space as the hardened steel clamped onto the flange of a vertical support beam 30 feet away. Jake initiated the ascent, relying entirely on the precision engineering of the specialized tool and the silent, high-torque micromotor housed within the claw assembly. Each movement was deliberate, minimized, and perfectly timed to coincide with the leader's slow, dragging footsteps below. He moved like a shadow cast by moonlight, utilizing the absolute lack of ambient light near the ceiling, where the industrial dust motes floated lazily in the thin, stray beams, filtering through the upper vents. The ascent was grueling. Pulling his weight vertically while maintaining absolute silence demanded every ounce of his core strength and focus. Below, the leader stopped, momentarily confused by the absence of sound, pivoting slowly, his pistol scanning the ground level. The man was operating purely on adrenaline and instinct now, his logic clouded by the unexpected loss of his subordinates and the psychological pressure of fighting an unseen, untouchable opponent. Jake paused momentarily, clinging tightly to the cold, oily steel of an upper cross brace, his breath held tight in his chest, allowing the leader to pass directly underneath him, unaware of the predator hovering just feet above his head. Jake reached the main I-beam that supported the central runway for the heavy hoist. The air here was colder, stratified, smelling faintly of old grease and trapped moisture. He secured a secondary tactical tether to the massive structural girder, ensuring his position was stable before beginning the final phase of his maneuver. He was positioned directly above the center of the concrete floor, granting him a clear, unobstructed angle onto the remaining threat. The leader, having found no trace of movement among the lower pallet stacks, began to move toward the center access aisle, a location that offered better visibility but simultaneously exposed him completely to the vertical threat. This was the moment Jake had anticipated. From his utility belt, he swiftly detached a specialized length of high-tensile polymer cordage, weighted heavily at one end with a non-metallic, impact-absorbing composite slug. This cordage was designed for precise, controlled entanglement and rapid deployment from elevation. He calculated the drop, accounting for the slight drift in the stale air and the leader's forward momentum. The objective was not harm, but immediate, non-lethal immobilization, securing the individual for later processing without further conflict or unnecessary escalation of force. He needed to disable the threat's ability to use the firearm without causing a severe fall or injury. With a silent exhale, he released the weighted cordage. Gravity took hold immediately. The sound was a faint whiz as the cord sliced through the air, accelerating rapidly toward the target. The leader, alerted by the sudden, minuscule change in the air pressure above him, began to raise his pistol, turning his head upward. But it was too late. The heavy slug struck his shoulder, a hard concussive impact, designed purely to disrupt his balance and motor control, instantly followed by the cord wrapping tightly around his torso and across his dominant arm, pinning the weapon against his side. The leader stumbled violently, the pistol clattering harmlessly onto the concrete floor, skittering away into the dark. The sudden, unexpected entanglement yanked him forward, leaving him momentarily winded and completely off balance, struggling against the unbreakable restraint that seemingly materialized from the ceiling. Jake did not wait for the man to recover. He initiated the rapid descent, utilizing the secured tether and specialized friction gloves, sliding down the line with controlled speed. He landed silently, less than 3 feet from the struggling leader, who was thrashing against the polymer restraint, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and fury. The man was strong, but the leverage provided by the cordage, anchored to the ceiling structure, made his struggles futile. Jake moved with surgical efficiency, pulling 2 heavy-duty reinforced flex cuffs from his belt kit. He grabbed the leader's exposed wrists, pressing the man's body firmly against the concrete floor, using strategic pressure points, ensuring compliance without pain, and secured the cuffs tightly. The struggle ceased instantly, replaced by ragged, defeated breathing. The last standing threat was neutralized. The silence that descended upon the warehouse was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the facility and the sound of Jake's own measured breathing. The fight was over. He quickly retrieved the fallen pistol, checking the chamber and dropping the magazine into his evidence pouch, standard operating procedure to ensure no loose firearms remained accessible. He knelt beside the restrained leader, checking his vital signs, confirming consciousness and lack of serious injury. The operation had been completed successfully. Non-lethal takedown, neutralization of all armed threats, and securing the scene. Jake activated the encrypted channel on his comm unit, speaking in a low, concise tone, his voice devoid of emotion. Redemption protocol executed. All primary threats neutralized and secured. Initiate extraction phase. Confirm status of targets. He waited 3 seconds, the only sound the faint static feedback in his earpiece. A crisp, professional voice responded instantly. Copy that, Ghost. Extraction team en route. Target secured and verified. Stand by for immediate ingress. This marked the end of the immediate conflict and the transition from the desperate fight for survival into the methodical, calculated phase of cleanup and resolution. The immediate priority shifted from defense to consolidation. Jake quickly scanned the area, ensuring the 2 earlier targets he had disabled remained unconscious and secured. He retrieved a small specialized transceiver from the leader's pocket, likely their communication link and tracking device, and immediately initiated a localized EMP burst from a small device on his belt, ensuring all immediate electronic communication within a 50-meter radius was permanently disabled, preventing any last-ditch distress signals or remote detonation attempts, though the latter was unlikely given the nature of the operation. He then turned his attention to the core reason he was there, the vulnerable individuals locked away in the makeshift detention area. He walked quickly but deliberately toward the heavily reinforced steel door at the far end of the warehouse, the entrance to the secondary structure where the victims were being held. The door was secured by a heavy electronic lock system, clearly visible even in the low light. Drawing a specialized multi-tool from his kit, a device that looked innocuous but housed sophisticated electronic bypass capabilities, he began working on the lock mechanism. This process required absolute focus and precision, bypassing complex proprietary security systems designed to resist brute force. He worked methodically, observing the flickering indicator lights, listening to the subtle clicks and hums of the internal mechanisms resisting his intrusion. The tension now was intellectual, a race against the clock of potential external alarms or secondary protocols rather than physical confrontation. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 90 seconds, the internal circuit board yielded. A soft, audible click resonated through the steel structure, and the heavy locking bolts retracted with a groan of stressed metal. Jake paused, placing a hand on the cold steel of the door, taking a final deep breath before swinging it inward. The atmosphere inside the secondary structure was immediately different, stale, heavy, and silent. It was a large, windowless room, dimly illuminated by a single weak fluorescent tube flickering overhead. Within the room, huddled together against the far wall, were the individuals he had come to protect. 6 people, primarily elderly, looking terrified, exhausted, and visibly traumatized, but physically unharmed. Their faces were etched with fear, their eyes wide and fixed on the imposing figure silhouetted in the doorway. Jake stepped fully into the room, his posture radiating calm authority, ensuring his hands were clearly visible and empty of weapons. He lowered his voice, projecting reassurance, not threat. "It is over," he stated, his voice firm and steady. "You are safe now. The immediate threat has been neutralized." He focused on the nearest individual, an older woman whose face was stained with dried tears. "I am here to get you out. I need you to stay calm and follow my directions precisely. We are moving quickly, but safely." He began quickly assessing their physical condition, noting any immediate injuries or medical needs, prioritizing the most vulnerable for the imminent extraction. The relief that washed over the faces of the detainees was palpable, a silent explosion of hope replacing crippling fear. One by one they began to stir, slowly rising from the floor, trusting implicitly in the figure who had risked everything to reach them. The extraction had begun. The darkness of the warehouse was about to give way to the promise of dawn, and justice, however unconventional, had been served. The shadow moved with an economy of motion honed by years of practice, his focus absolute. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation demanded precise execution of the extraction protocol. He used a low-lumen tactical light, casting just enough illumination to guide the group without attracting distant attention. The rescued individuals were fragile, both physically and psychologically. Their movements were jerky, marked by residual shock and exhaustion. He addressed them individually, his voice a low, steady current of control. "Slow steps. Stay close. We move along the wall." He prioritized the older woman and a young man who appeared to have sustained a minor leg injury, supporting them both while managing the pace of the entire group. They traversed the main floor of the storage unit, stepping carefully around scattered debris and the inert forms of the neutralized guards. The lack of blood or visible injury on the antagonists was a deliberate part of his protocol, non-lethal incapacitation designed to ensure a clean, legally manageable scene for the eventual authorities, minimizing complications to his mission's moral clarity. The route was complex, necessitating passage through 2 internal corridors and a secondary loading bay. Each doorway represented a potential ambush point, demanding a momentary halt and a rapid acoustic sweep of the adjacent area. The air in these back passages was heavy with the metallic scent of dust and stale industry, amplifying the sound of their collective, ragged breathing. He maintained a relentless internal count, ensuring no one lagged or strayed. The psychological burden of the escape was evident. One woman stumbled, letting out a stifled sob that threatened to unravel the fragile composure of the group. The shadow instantly stopped, placing a firm, stabilizing hand on her shoulder. He did not offer empty platitudes, only objective instructions. "Focus on the next step. We are almost clear. Your safety is guaranteed if you maintain silence and pace." His presence was a tangible anchor against the chaos they had just endured. The final obstacle was the rear service exit, sealed by a heavy industrial security door. This required a subtle bypass of the locking mechanism, a silent, practiced task that took less than 30 seconds. As the door hissed open, revealing the cold, pre-dawn air and the narrow service alley beyond, a collective, silent release of breath swept through the group. The change in atmosphere, the taste of clean, unsheltered air, signaled the final stage of their ordeal. He ushered them out quickly, ensuring they stayed within the shadows cast by the large waste compactors and storage containers lining the alley. This was the point of no return. His rendezvous point was a designated inconspicuous drop-off zone 3 blocks away, an abandoned municipal park maintenance yard, strategically chosen for its distance from the primary operations site and its accessibility to major thoroughfares, allowing rapid entry for emergency services. He led them there efficiently, maintaining a brisk pace that pushed their limits but minimized their exposure time. Upon reaching the secure perimeter of the maintenance yard, he quickly distributed small thermal blankets and sealed water bottles from his pack. He ensured they were positioned behind a large, dilapidated equipment shed, offering maximum concealment while awaiting pickup. The handover had to be swift and untraceable. He produced a dedicated, unregistered communications device preloaded with a single encrypted message template. The message was concise, containing precise coordinates, a brief assessment of the number of individuals and their immediate condition, and a clear anonymous warning regarding the nature of the criminal operation, just dismantled. He activated the transmission, verifying successful delivery to the established emergency contact liaison, a trusted, anonymous intermediary link that ensured the message reached the appropriate law enforcement and medical response teams without ever tracing back to his current location or specific identity. "Help is coming. They will arrive in minutes. Do not move from this spot." "You are safe now," he informed the group, his voice devoid of emotion, serving only as a final, reassuring confirmation of the impending relief. He spent a final, critical minute scanning the faces of the rescued, confirming their stability and ensuring they understood the instructions. The gratitude in their eyes was intense, silent, and deeply unsettling. He refused to meet it directly. He was not there for validation, only for execution. With the mission parameters satisfied and the vulnerable secured, the Shadow retreated. His exit was as meticulously planned as his entry. He moved silently through the dense foliage bordering the maintenance yard, disappearing back into the urban environment. He followed a predetermined escape route, utilizing drainage tunnels and back alleys designed to rapidly put distance between himself and the impending official response. As he moved, he executed his decontamination protocol, discarding temporary outer layers, wiping down all gear surfaces, and ensuring no trace evidence, hair, fiber, or dust was left behind that could connect him to the scene or the rescue operation. His vehicle, parked blocks away in a neutral zone, was accessed via a complex series of detours, ensuring any potential street cameras monitoring the arrival of emergency vehicles would not capture his departure trajectory. From a darkened vantage point atop a nearby warehouse roof, he watched the sequence unfold. Within 7 minutes, the quiet morning was shattered by the distant, accelerating wail of sirens. First one, then a cascade, indicating a serious, coordinated response. He observed the flashing lights converge on the maintenance yard. Paramedics, followed quickly by specialized police units, swarmed the area. The rescue was official, irreversible. The sight provided a momentary, deep satisfaction, the confirmation that the objective had been fully met. He did not linger. The longer he remained, the higher the risk of accidental observation. He melted away from the rooftop, the city slowly beginning to wake up beneath him. Epilogue: Consequences finesse et réflexion. 2 weeks later, the incident had faded from the immediate front pages, settling into the long, complex legal documentation of the justice system. The official reports characterized the raid as the result of a long-term anonymous intelligence operation that culminated in a decisive police action, leading to the apprehension of key figures in a significant organized crime network. The rescued individuals were undergoing rehabilitation and reintegration, their stories slowly being processed by social services and law enforcement. The silence surrounding the specific means of the neutralization of the guards, described simply as incapacitated prior to police arrival, remained intact. The existence of the Shadow was confined to police conjecture and encrypted internal memos, an unconfirmed phantom who had done the work the system could not or would not perform fast enough. Elias, the man beneath the tactical gear, sat in his highly controlled, subterranean workspace. The room was sterile, organized with military precision. He was not reviewing surveillance footage or planning the next infiltration. He was performing an after-action review of the recent operation, focused entirely on efficiency and moral justification. His computer screens displayed complex flowcharts detailing the resource allocation, time metrics, and, critically, the impact assessment on the rescued. He studied the faces of the victims, now public knowledge in the context of news coverage, ensuring that their suffering had been demonstrably halted and mitigated. This was the core of his self-imposed mandate: measurable, impactful protection. The systemic failures that allowed such vulnerability to exist were vast, but his intervention was precise, targeted at the point of immediate crisis. The moral dilemma was a constant companion, but one he managed through rigorous objectivity. He operated outside the legal framework, yet his actions aimed to reinforce the principles of justice the law was supposed to uphold. He never sought to destroy the system, only to compensate for its inertia and blind spots. His methods were invasive, but strictly bound by the commitment to non-lethal force and the preservation of life, even the lives of the perpetrators, ensuring that the legal consequences remained within the bounds of due process. He closed the file on the recent operation, tagging it as complete and successful. The physical and emotional costs were high, but the result was undeniable. Lives restored, a network dismantled, and a message sent into the dark corners of the city that some targets were protected and some actions would not go unanswered. The fear that drove the vulnerability of the innocent had been temporarily replaced by a cautious hope. Ilya stood, stretching muscles that still bore the tension of the recent conflict. He walked over to a wall that held neatly organized schematics and intelligence reports on ongoing threats, potential future interventions. His gaze settled on a file marked with a newly acquired priority designation, reports of predatory lending and intimidation targeting recent immigrants in the city's industrial periphery. A new vulnerability, a new injustice. He began the slow, methodical process of preliminary reconnaissance, his mind already shifting from reflection to preparation. He adjusted the calibration settings on a communication scrambler, his movements deliberate and quiet. The city still slept, unaware of the silent guardian preparing to step back into the shadows. The work was never truly over. Justice in this specific necessary form required constant vigilance, relentless precision, and the willingness to stand alone against the forces that preyed upon the defenseless. Elias knew his role. He was the necessary consequence, the quiet intervention, ready for the next call of the vulnerable. The shadow was operational once more.